let's install Elastic and Kibana. I have two VMs out in the cloud somewhere. Here on this left-hand side is a terminal window to the Elastic server, or what will become the Elastic server. This server has 16 gigabytes of memory. I think it's dual-core CPU and Ubuntu 20.04 installed on it. I have the domain elastic.evermite.net pointing to this server. I find that with Elastic, if I use less than 12 gigabytes of memory and less than a dual-core CPU, Elastic tends to have trouble starting up, or would crash and just behave more problematically. So 12 gigabytes seems to be okay for me. Here on this right-hand terminal window is the SSH instance to a 1 gigabyte memory server with a single core CPU. I have a domain name kibana.evermite.net pointing to it, so we will install Kibana on the server here on the right. Now, both of these are completely new installations of Ubuntu 20.04, so I think the first thing we should do is just do a distribution update and upgrade. So I'll do it with this command here, apt-get update, apt-dist upgrade -y, -y just to say yes to all the default options. I'll do this for the Kibana server as well, and this might take a moment. So the upgrades are complete on both the Elastic and Kibana server. I'm going to install a few more tools. I like the Vim text editor, so I'm going to install that. We definitely need curl, new PG, and GPG. So let's install those on these machines. Okay. So next, we're going to need to install Elastic, configure Elastic, and run Elastic. Then install Kibana, configure Kibana, and then run Kibana. Actually, since the installation process for Elastic and Kibana are going to be very similar, let's just do the installation for both at the same time. If I go to the Elasticsearch documentation on how to install Elastic, you'll see that the steps are get the key rings, install the app transport, update your repository definition, and finally just run the apt-get update and install Elasticsearch. The Kibana installation instructions is exactly the same, except the very last word, instead of installing Elasticsearch, you're installing Kibana. So because of that, I'm just going to take these commands and paste it into a bash script so that later I can just reuse it. All right, so if I start a bash script here, and just paste these commands in here, get the keyring, apt transport, update repository definitions, and finally update and install Elasticsearch. Right, so I'm gonna save this, and it's the same steps for Kibana, except the last word, instead of Elasticsearch, it's Kibana. Let's paste this in here, and this is Kibana. Let's save this, make it executable, and just go ahead and install Kibana. And we're going to do the same for Elasticsearch. And this could take a minute or so while it installs everything. So now both Elastic and Kibana have been installed. It's time to configure both of these before running them. We're going to configure Elastic first. So for this Kibana window, I'll just clear this stuff we don't need. But for the Elastic, let me just make this a bit bigger. What you're going to notice is that as soon as the installation finished, it created a super user with the username Elastic, and it generated a default password, which I'm going to copy and paste into a text editor that I have on a second monitor that you can't see, because we're going to need this password later. When you get Kibana running, you're going to go to a web browser, and there's going to be a login screen. You type in Elastic as the username, and you can supply a password to log in as the super user. You probably want to use a less privileged user when using Kibana for most things. But for the purpose of this demonstration, we'll just stick to the super user. And one of the things we will do is we're going to change the password for the super user, so we're not using the one that's automatically created by Elastic. So I think we're pretty much ready to start configuring Elastic. So let's start with that. We're going to go into the etc folder, into the Elastic folder. And if we open up the configuration file, which is elasticsearch.yml, there's a few things we need to change. The first is the cluster name, or we should give it a cluster name. Give it something meaningful to you. So I'm going to call mine ESDemo. Next thing we should do is update the network host name. Now, if you're using an IP address, you can stick in the IP address here, the publicly accessible IP address, or even local area network if you plan to use it local in a local network. I have a domain name mapped to it, so I'm going to use the domain name instead. And also because I have an SSL certificate that's been generated by Let's Encrypt that I want to use with this domain for security reasons, so that all traffic is encrypted. Next thing you want to do is change the port number, or at least specify the port number. The default is 9200, but for security reasons, you probably want to update it to a non-default port number. Next thing we want to do is, let's scroll down, is the security section. All right, so this block here is the security section, and when you install Elastic, it automatically generates an SSL certificate for you, which you can use. And if you keep things enabled, you'll start using that. We want to use our own SSL certificate, so therefore we're going to modify these settings. If you want to use the default, you don't have to do anything else. You can at this point just exit this YAML file and just start up Elastic. But we're going to use our own. So make sure security.enabled is true, enrollment enabled is true. Now we start copying over the values for the SSL certificate for use by the REST HTTP API, and also for the transport layer for communication between cluster nodes. Which reminds me, we actually need to put our certificates on this server. So let's actually make the certs directory. Oh, right, it already exists. That's because when you install Elastic, it creates a default SSL certificate for you. So you can see that right here. Right, so if you just don't edit the SSL block of the YAML file, it will automatically use this certificate. But we're going to make our own, or we're going to use our own. So I'm going to create a directory here. And let's see. I'm going to open up a terminal window on my computer because on my local machine, I have the certificates already all here. So I'm going to copy them, SCP them into my Elastic server. All right. And there we go. So I believe those certificates should be in here now. Yeah. Oh, this reminds me. You can see these files are owned by root. In much of the Elastic documentation, it recommends that many of the operations you do should be done with the Elasticsearch user. I had some permission issues or file permission issues when using Elasticsearch user. So I'm going to do everything as root and then manually chmod and chown the files back to Elasticsearch afterwards. So I'm going to make everything owned by the Elasticsearch user. In here. All right, so that looks okay, and that looks okay. So now let's go back to the YAML file and point to the certificates. So what we'll do is here, the private key is certs elastic.evermite.net. Okay, and the certificate is going to be the full chain file that Let's Encrypt gave me. We're not going to use this key store path. Okay, and for the transport layer, we're not going to use these default. We're going to use my certificates for the transport layer as well. And I believe that's all we need to do here. So if we review this file, the changes were change the cluster name, change the network host, change the HTTP port. If you want to use the default SSL certificates, you don't need to do anything else. You can exit this file. But for us, we want to use our own SSL certificates, and therefore we make sure security is enabled, enrollment enabled, point to our certificates in both the HTTP SSL and transport.ssl block. And I believe that should be it. Systemctl enable elasticsearch.service, and then we go ahead and start it up. Now I noticed that sometimes when I try to start Elasticsearch service, it seems to stall or time out, and I might have to try restarting, stopping, start a few times with maybe a few breaks in between before it actually works. So hopefully it won't take too many attempts to restart it once this thing goes. I'm going to give it a few minutes, probably not a few minutes, maybe another minute for this thing to start up. So let's just wait. And so you can see things actually failed because of a timeout. I'll just double check the journal CTL to see if there's anything interesting. Just timeout. Yeah, so let me just try this again. All right, so give it a moment. Oh, surprisingly, it actually worked this time. I think it worked. Usually it takes a few more times for me to restart before it seems to go. And by the way, adding more memories didn't seem to help at all. It just seems pretty problematic when it will or will not start up for me. But looks like it is, so I can verify if it is or isn't working with a curl statement to the API. So let me just find my curl statement that I had pasted somewhere else. Here it is. So I'm going to copy my command and paste it in here. So I'm going to ping the API. I'm going to be verbose about it. I'm going to have to authenticate with the regular Elastic user. And let's see if I get a good response. All right, I'm going to paste in the super user password that came with the installation. This looks good. All right, this looks good. All the SSL handshake has happened. Yeah, our Elastic server is up and running and everything seems to be fine at this point. But also one of the things I actually wanted to do was change the password of the super user. So I'm going to go to this folder here, Elasticsearch in the binaries folder. When you install Elastic, it comes with some command line tools or binary files that you will find useful, and one of them is resetting the Elasticsearch, using Elasticsearch to reset the password. So let's do that. Reset password. Interactive, so I can type in the password that I want. And for the user, Elastic. So let's reset the password for Elastic. Okay, we have an error. Oh, I remember this one. So the reason this command failed is because, in fact, it kind of says it in the description somewhere here, is that we're trying to ping the IP address of the server. So this Elastic server uses this IP address, but the SSL is for the elastic.evermite.net. So it's just having trouble verifying the SSL. So what we can do then instead is you can take a look at the help actually. The help will give you some extra command or flags that you should use. I'm going to append the -- URL flag so that we can verify the SSL. So we're going to actually run our reset password command against this URL instead. At port 9200, and it should prompt us for a password, hopefully. Yes, we want to change the password and type in a new password. And now your super user will have the new password that you just made. So that, I believe, is all we need to do for now with the Elastic server, and we should be ready to start installing things on the, or configuring the Kibana server. Okay, so let's go back here, and we're going to go into the etc folder, into the Kibana directory, and let's configure Kibana with the kibana.yml file. I'll make this bigger now. There's a few things we need to change here. So the first thing we should change is, of course, or at least specify explicitly, is the port number. So we're going to use a standard port of 5601. I recommend for your production usage, change it to something that's not standard. For the server host, you'll have to make sure it's a non-loopback value. So if I had typed in, let's say, Kibana, I have a kibana.evermite.net pointing to this. I think sometimes if I use that, it doesn't seem to work nicely or just something fails. But I'll use this 0.0.0.0, and that seems to be fine here. The public server, or for people to publicly access it. I'm actually going to use an SSL, so I'm going to use HTTPS. If you're not using SSL, you can just drop the S. Kibana.evermite.net. So that's how people are going to access it. Oh, and don't forget the actual port number. Okay, so let's see what else we need to do at this point. All right, because I'm using HTTPS, I need to specify the SSL certificates for kibana.evermite.net. Oh, and set this to true. And now a path to our certificate. Oh, I did not actually. I'm going to have to make a folder called certs because we need to copy SCP the certificates from my local computer onto this server. So let's come back over here. Let's find my SCP command that I've done quite a few times because I've done a few dry runs. All right. So, we're going to need another directory. Kibana.evermite.net. All right, so let's copy things over. And there we go. I think we should have something here. Great. I am going to make these files all owned by Kibana. The entire search folder to be owned and by the Kibana. And I think now we can come back here. And now we specify the path to the certificate. Now, in the past, I've made the mistake of having this be a relative path like this. Kibana.evermite.net, and then certificate, so that would be the full chain. And this relative path didn't actually work. I actually had to state the full path. And if you gave it the relative path, when you try to start up the systemctl start kibana.service, your journal CTL will just tell you that it wasn't able to find this file. All right. So I'm going to also state the private key. And I believe that just by having these 3 lines, you should be able to access the Kibana URL from a web browser with HTTPS. If you don't want HTTPS, just drop the S from here and leave these 3 lines commented out. All right, next is we need Kibana just talk with Elasticsearch. So let's specify the destination, or where the Elasticsearch server is. All right. And then Kibana will need to authenticate against the Elastic server. So you could set up a Kibana user with a Kibana password and write it into this YAML file here. And that way Kibana can authenticate against the Elastic server. If you do this, don't use the super user. Don't use the Elastic super user here. Just make an actual new user, a new password. That's not the step I'm going to do. I'm going to instead use what we call is the service account. And for a service account, you have to create a service account token. In Elastic, there are several types of service accounts. So let's have the tab here. There's a service account for Fleet Server. I'm not going to talk about that in this video. You can create a service account for Elastic Kibana. And you can create a service account for Elastic Enterprise Search Server. Right? So we're going to create a service account for this one, and then create a token for this service account. To do that, we are going to go back to our Elastic terminal window. So this here, and if you look in these files here, you can see that there's a command to help you make service tokens. So you can actually say Elasticsearch service tokens help, and you will see some of the commands available to you. So you can go Elasticsearch service tokens create. Then you're going to have to state the service account type, which can either be Elastic Fleet Server, Elastic Kibana, or Elastic Enterprise Search Server. And the final argument it takes is the name of the token, which is just something you can choose. Right? So let's actually run this command. I'm going to make this window a little bit bigger. We're going to create the Elastic Kibana type of service account, and we'll give the token a name. We'll just say Kibana token. Just keep it simple like that. All right, and let's see. And there we go. So we have this token that's been made. And what we can do at this point is actually paste that token into this YAML file right here, like this. We could just do that, save, and continue. But I'm not going to do that because I don't like having plain text for any secrets like passwords and tokens. I don't like them being visible in plain text in a file. So what we're going to do instead is make use of Kibana's key store for secure settings. Right? So if you look in our Kibana server, I'm going to exit out of here for a moment. If you go to the USR share Kibana directory, binary directory, you're going to see that when you were installing Kibana, when you install Kibana, it came with some command line tools that you can use, just like the way we got some command line tools for the Elastic installation. And one of those is the Kibana key store command, which will encrypt any secrets and store it in another file, in a key store file, which when you load up Kibana, it will read the encrypted values from that key store and make them as part of the values that would be used by Kibana. So to run this key store create command, we're going to need to remember the token or the property in the YAML file that we actually want to set, right? So let's go back to this file because I have to remember what this was. It was elasticsearch.service account token. So that's, I'm going to copy that, and now I'm ready to run it. Oh, by the way, if you look in this etc Kibana directory, you see that the Kibana.keystore file is already there. So there's no need to run the Kibana keystore create. We already have that file. In fact, you can run the keystore list. Let's actually go to USR share Kibana bind. And if you run keystore, Kibana keystore list, you can see if there's any. So none, there's no property value, key value pair in there yet. So let's start one. Let's add, and we're gonna create this property. or assign a value to this property. The value we want is from what the Elastic server has given us. I'm going to paste it in here. And just like that, if we go back to the etc directory, Kibana, in fact, let's run this list command. You can see that now this property has been set with the value we pasted in here, such that when we actually load up the Kibana.yml file during runtime, this property will be dynamically set from the key store, right? So that's just, for me, it seems like a very useful way of just upgrading, to improve the security of your Kibana instance. Okay, so we've set this service account token. What's the next thing we want to do is, I remember there's one more setting here. Right. When we're connecting with Elasticsearch, one thing I want to do is actually turn on this Elasticsearch SSL verification mode. I want it to be full verification, just to make sure the certificates that we're using from the Elasticsearch server is properly validated or properly verified. The other options that you can use for this could be a certificate or none. If you're in a dev mode, sometimes you might be using self-signed certificates on the Elastic server, or the default certificate that Elastic gave you. I believe you might want to set it to none if you have any problems verifying any more development-like types of certificate. So I think that's all we need to do for the Kibana configuration. Let's summarize all the changes we had to do. Specify the server.port, specify the server.host for Kibana. Make sure it's non-loopback. That's why I use the 00000. The public base URL, just the URL you want to have your browser connect to for the Kibana instance. Put in your certificate information. Make sure it's an absolute path. Unlike the Elastic server that takes relative path, Kibana seems to need the absolute path. Specify the destination or where your Elastic server is. And I prefer to set the elasticsearch.ssl verification mode to full. And I think we're ready to start the Kibana instance. Enable. And let's start it. Let's take a look at the status. So if things fail, it will normally show up in the status, or if you journal ctl-u kibana.service, it should give you a bit more details on why things failed if they did fail. And sometimes it'll point you to the log file for more details. Let's see if things are running, and if things are going, I should be able to see it in the browser. So let me just type things into the browser and see if things are up and running yet. Okay, things are going okay. So sometimes while it's still loading, you're going to see this Kibana server is not ready yet, or it just might be unreachable. If things take too long to start up, usually it doesn't take more than 30 seconds for, at least for me, it doesn't take more than 30 seconds for things to start up. Let's take a look over here. Oh, look at that. There's an error. So although Kibana itself is loaded, I think it's not completely working yet. What's the reason? The error is security exception failed with the token name. Okay, so something's wrong with our token. Oh, I remember why. Yes, I forgot. So if you recall, somewhere earlier I was saying most of the documentation suggests that you use the Elasticsearch user, especially when you're running these binary commands on the Elasticsearch server. We're using root, so it's going to be I'm pretty sure it's a file permission issue. I've run into this many times before. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to manually change things. So let's go to Elasticsearch directory. You're going to see that our service tokens are actually written to this file here. So every time I ran this Elasticsearch service tokens, it gets stored in this file. and you can see it's there. We have the Elastic Kibana service account and the token name is Kibana token, but Elasticsearch is probably having trouble reading this file because it's owned by root. Yeah, so it's not privileged enough for Elasticsearch user is not privileged enough to see it. So let's actually, I think this might fix it. Ch own Elasticsearch, the service tokens file, and let's actually see if, I don't think I have to restart Elasticsearch. So I'm gonna just see what happens if I hit restart on this. And let's just take a look, keep an eye on the status. Okay, so I had to restart Elasticsearch again. So the chown on itself didn't fix it, but after I did systemctl restart and on the Elasticsearch, and then I do a systemctl restart on Kibana, then it seems like no errors from the system status. So let's see if I hit refresh on this web browser now. Okay, there we go. So now Kibana is up and running, and we can actually log in with that super user with the password that we changed. And it looks like everything is working. And so there we go. You now have a running instance of Kibana using some of the baseline security settings that come with the ELK stack.